Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ReadyTech Remote Control Series, episode 15. My name is James Horn. I'm the Commercial Director here at JobReady, part of the ReadyTech Group. And we will introduce the panelists in a second. First, I'm going to introduce the topic. So today we're going to be discussing digital transformation, a topic that many of you would have discussed and be relatively familiar with. Today's session is about bringing a practical view to that conversation and hearing from at least one subject matter expert in Mark Cameron, who we'll introduce shortly, and really try and tease out some of the common themes, considerations, questions, and potential risks that go with digital transformation. I think many of you who have participated in some of the other remote control sessions would have heard us talk about this topic loosely in some of those other episodes. But for the most part, digital transformation has been a hot topic for the last couple of years. And we're really hoping that we can sort of unpack some of the complexity in that and land on a really clear view and empower you guys to actually take some practical advice and guidance from Mark and Chris today and start to implement that within your organizations as soon as possible. So introducing today's talent, we have Mark Cameron, CEO of W3 Digital. Formal welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here.
And
looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And we have Chris Smith, who's Head of Strategy and Innovation at ReadyTech. Morning, Chris.
Good morning, James.
So to dive, I suppose, straight into today's session and today's topic, I'm going to hand the controls over to Mark. And Mark, I think it'd be really useful for you to introduce yourself in a bit more detail to the audience. So I'm just going to stop sharing and allow you to pull up your deck.
Sure.
And for those of you who've not met Mark or come across W3 Digital in the past, Mark, do you want to just talk us through a bit about what we're going to be covering today and a little bit about yourself and W3 Digital?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to cover first, because that's the slide in front of me. Really, we're going to talk about the historical context of what digital transformation is and how it's changed, like the terminology and the thinking around it sort of shifted and morphed and matured over the last few years. Then think about, as a leader of an organization and in the education space, what do you have to do to start to develop the case for change, develop the right kind of narrative, think about how you set your strategy, which of course is really an exercise in deciding what not to do as opposed to trying to do everything. Then start thinking through what capabilities you're going to need to be able to execute. And then what the design process looks like. The digital transformation in many cases is 60%, organizational culture and business design, and 40% sort of technology and so on. So it's a lot of the effort has to actually go into the people aspect of it.
Okay.
And then thinking through and talking about the technology, and then and then finally that culture piece. What do you actually want to do? What kind of culture do you want to create? And then from that, we can sort of talk about some tips about getting started, if that's the direction you want to go.
All right, awesome. So just that's a sort of a gentle introduction to today's session, just some housekeeping as well. You'll notice at either the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on how you've configured this morning's Zoom, there's a Q&A section. So we'll be monitoring that Q&A. I'll be ensuring that all the questions are covered. We do have little stop points at the end of each sort of topic or theme, and I'll be encouraging you guys to interact with the panelists at the end of each of those themes. And then we obviously have time at the end to cover the Q&A that we don't get to as part of those little junctions. The other thing to remind everyone is today's session is being recorded, so we'll be circulating the recording once it's been through the editing suite, probably in the next 24 hours or early next week. And kindly, Mark and Chris have agreed to allow us to share today's deck. So we want it to take on, I suppose, a personality of a bit of a workbook or a playbook, so you guys can have that takeaway asset. So try and take some notes as Mark works through some of these themes. So Mark, a bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So, okay. There we go. So I just give a bit of history about me. So I started my career in advertising initially in the 90s in New Zealand. And yeah, so towards the late 90s, I started doing a lot of digital strategy work and joined a company called Hyperactive in New Zealand, which is kind of one of the first big digital agencies in New Zealand at that point. And around about 2001, I moved to, well, actually in 2001, I moved to Australia. I actually had a job lined up in New York for the beginning of 2002, but September 11 happened and I ended up staying here. So I ended up staying here, and at that stage I was a bit of a digital strategies, a bit of gun for hire. I was doing work with Telstra and Heinz Waddies and a bunch of others. I joined W3 Digital, W3 it was called then, in 2003, and then I took it over and took the reins in about 2007. And since then, been remodeling it from a branding comms business into a digital agency initially, and now over the last 5 years, really into a management consultancy that helps organizations go through digital transformation work. And we're now a strategic partner of Telstra, as it says there, so working across health, government, education sector, a lot of sort of finance stuff as well. But while I was doing that, I ended up doing quite a lot of writing. I started, just doing blogging for myself, and then I ended up getting picked up by a few magazines, and then BRW asked me to do a feature, and then they asked me to do a column once a month, and then it became once a fortnight, and then it became once a week. So I sort of ended up writing 500 or 600 articles on digital transformation and what was happening in the space globally and the Australian context. And as I've been going through, I've also become specialists in the education space. So working across universities in the TAFE sector and doing a lot in that space right at the moment. Also to do mentoring particularly around technology startups for RMIT Activator. And I was lucky enough when I was doing some work for a company called SAP in North America to meet a guy called Joe Pine, who wrote the book, The Experience Economy, which is, you might have heard that saying before. He's kind of the guy that actually wrote the book on it. And I ended up doing his course at one point, and as a result, I was the only person in the country who's actually certified in that framework.
Okay.
So that's kind of a bit about me. There's a few other points there, but I work pretty across a lot of different areas.
Obviously, today's very much tailored towards that education, digital transformation conversation, and part of the reason that we've got Chris Smith joining us today is Chris's experience in supporting and I suppose nurturing clients through. It looks like the defensive strategies failed you in the background there.
That is, yeah.
And so we're going to be hearing from Chris from that, I suppose, from that technology perspective.
Sure.
Just while Mark, small distraction. Chris, you want to just give the audience a bit of a background on your experience as well?
Yeah, sure, James. Obviously, Mark's established his credentials in this space, and they are outstanding. So I neglected to put a slide together because mine are not quite as strong as those. I think for me, as head of strategy and innovation for ReadyTech in education, it's about us putting products and services into market that are meeting requirements for now, but also what that looks like into the future, and just making sure we're adapting to the changes that are happening on the ground and being across those and predicting and forecasting those. So we're effectively an active participant in that digital transformation and change as a core application that you'd expect an education provider to use. So for us, we have a vested interest in this concept of digital transformation. I think for us, we see it as super important to protect and ensure resilience into the future. So I think that's sort of where we land. I think we may just have lost James temporarily there. Seems like he's back, but yeah, I think that's the perspective that I'm going to lend today. It's our experience in implementation, in procurement, and just sort of giving that voice from the tech side.
Great. And I just dropped out there for a moment. Thanks, Chris. All right, Mark, do you want to introduce how we're going to tackle today?
Yeah, so we're going to have a look at a fairly basic framework, I think, for thinking about digital transformation. Now, we won't use these exact words, but in summary, as a leader of an organization, no matter what size, there's a few phases you have to go through to create organizational change. And part of that is really starting to build a very strong narrative. As we all know, there's kind of two main parts to building, and two main directions you can build a narrative. One is the burning platform. So, are we doing this to survive and we have to do it, or it's the big opportunity? And the big opportunity is, this is a great moment in time. Let's have a look at things. There's a huge prize for us if we get this right. And as you're starting to do that, that allows you to build your business case and develop some focus, which you can then take that information and move through to your strategy phase. And in strategy phase is really doing the deeper research, the deeper understanding to really work through what your options are, where your opportunities are, and then think through what you need to do. Then you can go into the design phase, and that's really where you start to design out what your target state looks like. And I say experience there for staff and students, but it's across the whole organization. What is your operating model, culture? How are you going to design all the aspects of your organization to be able to fulfill on this dream? And then finally, not finally, but then how do you start to identify the technology and capability to be able to deliver on that? So what are your enablers? And then how do you actually set your organization up to build that delivery engine? How does everybody in your organization start to shift to become if it's really going to be digital transformation as opposed to implementing a few tools, if it's going to start to do that, how do we shift that whole culture to becoming a digital first or a digital native culture? Okay. So that's fundamentally what we're going to talk about. Look through some of the options, talk about what other organizations have done, where some get it right, where some get it wrong, and then try and hopefully find an area where it was mark on the ground that feels right for everybody.
Okay, great.
Cool. So I'll carry on. So if you're looking at developing the case for change, so in this presentation, you'll see a few illustrations and images and so on. These are really sort of reference for later on. But in the developing the case for change, that's the kind of messy phase. That's the phase where you're starting to initially just have lots of conversations, and then you're starting to collect some information, ask people, what's right or wrong, and then start to try and pull that together into some kind of structured thinking. It's really that business case piece, going, does this make sense for us? Should we even invest in doing the formal strategy phase, or what does this actually mean for our organization?
Yep.
So when you're doing that, what's really critical to do is really start the conversation initially. So particularly with leaders inside the organization, start to ask, what's the big opportunity here for us, or what's the big threat for us in the market? How do we shape this up as an opportunity? How do we even go about researching it? And I think quite often thinking through how many processes inside your organization may have sort of got cumbersome over time, starting to think about the culture of the organization and start thinking about the expectations of teaching staff and students and so on is a really good way to start to frame it up. And that's where the research analysis and kind of experience mapping phase becomes critically important. So you can sort of start to look at where there might be issues in the organization, or where there might be really big opportunities to stand out and be an individual. Okay. And then start to think about the base for which you're going to build the business case around. Is it a cost reduction, which is absolutely valid. I would also say that it can create, if it's just cost reduction, you can start to undermine some cultural elements. Is it revenue improvement, which again is very, very valid, but sort of how and where and why. And is it sort of longitudinal job outcomes, for example? So, student outcome focus, looking at every stage of that student journey and working out how you're going to really help that student have the best possible outcome at every phase. And that one there really is kind of the way that we end up quite often shaping the conversation. You can achieve the other two by focusing on that last one there. And the reason for that is, you might have heard a lot about student life cycle and customer experience or student experience. That's the key. If you have that really relentless focus on the student, then it becomes a very clear focal point for developing a business case and a broader strategy.
Yeah, okay. I think just to go back a step as well.
Sure.
When we're talking about designing the business case, in your experience, who would typically own this conversation? Who would be responsible for even starting this process?
It's a good question, and it depends on the organisation. So often it will be the CEO and the exec team will own it and be presenting it, presenting it to the board. But increasingly, what we're seeing is a pattern of behaviour. And this is not just in education, this is across business in Australia, where the board is increasingly asking the CEO and the executive team, what is your customer strategy or your student strategy and the digital strategy that goes along with it? Mm-hmm. And they are often actually moving CEOs along if they don't believe that strategy is actually valid. And that pattern of behaviour has been happening in the US for probably about 5 years, and it's really starting to move here at the moment as well. So I think at a governance level, it's understood that a digital strategy is no longer kind of a nice to have or transformation strategy. It's really it's really a necessity.
Core strategy, yeah, right. And Chris, as ReadyTech's head of strategy and innovation, or innovation and strategy, how did you come about that role? How did you take ownership of that? Because I think it's important that in a lot of organisations that are not only dialed in today, but that we're speaking to broadly, there isn't a clear owner or director, but everyone's talking about what they need to do next. So how did you find yourself in this situation?
It's a good question. I think for me, it's a slightly different path. I think it was pretty obvious that I had the healthiest amount of curiosity within originally Job Ready. So probably the one that was researching the most, had a curiosity about where we should be. And then ultimately, I got support from our CEO to set a strategy, a vision for the education part of the business. And that support was pretty critical because it meant that we could take a bit more of a long view, start to think about how we were going to budget and invest in that. And I think from ReadyTech's perspective, that sense of where do you want to be in 1, 2, 5 years just gave us some targets to aim for.
Yeah.
And executive support was critical. But I became the owner of that just by virtue of there was a space, and I just naturally moved into it. And then we worked out how to do that on the fly. And sometimes, I think Mark will talk to this later, sometimes you've got the talent within, someone that can actually fulfill that role. And sometimes you might have to look outside of the organization. So,
yeah, I think it's a really valid point that when we're talking about how to get started, which today is very much sort of core theme, it's ownership and who is actually going to take charge. So, yeah, it's interesting that you had similar themes there, Mark. You're talking about board and exec level driving that, and Chris, you've kind of echoed that with particularly from that support and backing from that executive level. So that seems to be very key.
Yeah, it's increasingly hitting into the board and exec level, because I think the thinking's shifted around from it being, it's a risk to invest in this. I think it's the counterfactual risk of not investing in it is much greater.
Sure.
So I think it's become a kind of governance thing now.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so yeah, so really sort of, I mean, what should you do really if you want to sort of start that process off? So just starting to build that case for change. Here's a few tips here is, just start by talking to your people. I think that's a really, really good process. Start by talking to your people about what they're seeing in the market around digital, what they're seeing in the market around technology, what they think is working. Asking them where are the big time sinks for the people. Where are the things that could be automated, or we could move stuff away from paper to online tools, for example. Just start to think about all of those elements coming together and going, what is that? If we could start to shift all of that way, what does that mean for our organization? If we could take away a lot of the administrative work and free our people up to actually be delivering value to our students and thinking about the course material more effectively and thinking about the student experience more effectively, what do you think that would do for your brand? And just have those conversations, ask some hard questions, and then see where those conversations take you. Obviously, identify those key drivers, so the financial, brand, operational drivers, and then go through some kind of options analysis. Make sure before you start engaging, start thinking through, what are your options, and start trying to define what digital means for you, for your organization. And then just as a starting point, just start to draft a narrative up, start to say, this is why we're going to do this. Just have a narrative or a few sentences that you can hold yourself, that you can start to test as you go forward into the strategy phase.
Okay. I think we're going to cover off some of the other potentially external conversations that they need to start having around, often, we've talked about this in prep for today, that the digital transformation, usually the last people to arrive at that conversation are the people providing the digital component.
Yeah.
We'll discuss that a bit later. So what are we doing? What are we doing after we've identified, the purpose?
Well, we need to start moving into the strategic direction, and the strategic direction, you need to have a look at different aspects. And this is a model here that you might want to use. And it's kind of like, this is where kind of what we think about as kind of best elements to actually building a strategy. So having a really bold long-term orientation. So something that's still going to be executed well after you may have left, for example. And that should be, we should be trying to set the business up for a long period of time with the way you think about digital. So it's not necessarily about, one or two projects. It's a way the organization is going to operate ongoing. And make sure that it's very, very, very clearly linked to the overarching business strategy. So what is your overarching strategic direction, and how does this digital strategy and digital transformation strategy, how is that a articulation of that business strategy?
Sure.
And then, of course, center around customer needs, however you want to define customer. Obviously you've got your students as customers, but you've got broader stakeholders. You've got, government and maybe the organizations that you deal with. And then you've got teachers. So they start thinking through those stakeholders and start thinking about them as almost like a customer. I know that sort of language doesn't always sit well in the education space, but it's an important sort of shift in mindset that I think can be quite helpful. Then start thinking through your personal risk appetite. I think particularly in this space, the risk appetite, a few months ago for thinking about moving all courses online was quite low. But then, sort of the COVID thing hit, and then all of a sudden it's shifted up really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And I won't go through all of these, but there's a few things here. How do we move fast? How do we test? Thinking about the culture you want inside the organization from a collaboration and direction standpoint, and then what capabilities do you need inside the organization? Some of those are going to be really, really important to actually make it work. In fact, probably most of them. And then how are you going to govern this? What are the roles, responsibilities, organizational structure, KPIs that you're going to need? How do you talk about investment? And how will it change your operating model, so your organizational momentum as you go forward?
Yeah. I think the one thing to call out, which is good segue into this slide, is is trying to understand. This is not one big project, as you say, Mark. Chris, I'll probably get your thoughts on this as well. But when you're talking to an organisation about how you undertake digital transformation, do you prefer to talk about this as one large project, a series of small and discrete projects to build momentum or confidence? How do you actually frame that and position that with your customers? That one's to you, Mark.
Right. Look, it's a difficult one to sort of think through. I mean, there's in the end, I think a strategy really needs to be the narrative that can be held by the organisation. And I think the simpler you make that sort of starting narrative, and the focus around it, the easier it is. I think there's been a real temptation, or there's been confusion about what digital transformation is, particularly in the education space, for a long time. So I think for many organisations or many leaders inside actually business space in general, digital transformation was actually just moving marketing dollars online. So it was really about how do we actually shift a lot of our marketing to your social media space, and we take advantage of all those different types of technologies, where that is because obviously the number of channels that we can now reach a student has grown exponentially, and the view is that students spend less time on traditional channels. But of course that's just one teeny little part of the student life cycle. And I think really start to think about what's that singular focus that we're going to try and bring to bear that everything can connect into. I think is a really powerful way of trying to build it up.
Yeah, okay. And Chris, in your experience, because you've been a part of many change projects, that big bang versus piecemeal, what have you seen?
Yeah, sure. I think it's actually interesting to draw a comparison with our own digital transformation. I think 4 years ago, we did some self-reflection as an organization about how we can be relevant and how we can compete continually with the forces in play in our market. And I think one of the things that we decided to do was move to Agile, and that was a long time ago. And what it did is accelerate our own ability for change internally. So we went to a much more rapid release cycle. We got things to market faster, and we built a culture inside our organization that was attuned to that. And I think, after 4 years of doing sort of fortnightly releases, the whole staff, the whole organization works to that cadence and expect change at those intervals. It's just built into our DNA now. And what that means is when something changes, we can respond faster. I think COVID was a really good measure of that. We got online super fast. We mobilized working from home fast. It's just in our nature now. It's actually in there. And that's just an ongoing commitment. And I think that is a really good comparison, that they don't have to be these huge projects that I think often introduce overwhelm as a state up front. We just decided that we're going to change the operating rhythm within our business, and that's just helped us. Certainly when it comes to things like digital transformation, it's much more of a piecemeal. We do it smaller incremental change, and we see that as first of all achievable, and also then quite measurable. So that's kind of probably the biggest thing. I think when we see projects in education, it's typically, for us as a student management system, we often see it as part of an implementation, and they can be long and they can be complex, and often huge investment from both sides. So I think that concept of picking out smaller incremental change can help, or experiment with smaller projects before you commit to a full one is something that could be useful as well.
Yeah, I'm going to build on that a bit, because I think you're absolutely right. That smaller little, sort of little steps along the journey and the momentum behind them is incredibly important. It's I think the term that we use a lot is believable momentum. So rather than a big project where there's a few people locked away for ages trying to design everything and then present it to the organization and then the organization says, well, actually, a whole bunch of your assumptions are wrong, or the world's shifted since you started, or whatever else it may be. Have a big, bold vision, but don't necessarily create lots and lots of detail around that. They then start to build a lot of momentum that people can believe in and be part of really quickly. And I think that's important as a strategic direction, because you can tell that narrative as you go through, and people can, if you have time to sort of look back and go, look what we've achieved is great, as opposed to just looking for quick wins. I think the thing about quick wins, particularly in the technology space, is about quickly getting a revenue boost, or quickly getting a cost cut, or whatever else it may be. And those things are achievable, but it's kind of they don't necessarily hang together. They don't necessarily hang together and create a narrative unless it's been designed that way. And it's kind of that. Probably heard the sort of saying, if quick wins is kind of like having a sugar hit. You sort of, you can keep going on it for a while, but at some point you have to sit down and eat a whole meal. So I think that's a worthwhile kind of analogy there.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a good segue into the next discussion point, Mark, which is around the design piece. So
yeah. So here's a service blueprint, and I'll talk a little bit about that as a model, but we've heard about journey maps probably before, maybe student personas. Here's a tool that we like to use where it's looking at what are the stages a student's going through, what are they thinking, what is the student trying to achieve at each one of those stages, and there's different types of research you can do to be able to extract that information, and then what are the different channels and interaction points. What are the actions the student's actually taking, and then what are the actions the staff need to take to be able to fulfill that, and then what are the technology capabilities and skills, knowledge, and experience required to be able to enable all of that. And if we can sort of divide that up into sections, what becomes really clear as you start to try and map that out as a current state quite often is where all the really, really, really illogical processes within inside your organization actually sit. And those ones that have been grown organically, particularly with organizations that have scaled quickly, and then maybe contracted a bit, then have to scale quickly again, which happens in the education space. That's where you get a lot of organic processes that actually have massive logical breaks in them, and of course your people just work their way around it, but that's actually a big risk. So designing for success is there's lots of different ways of designing, your organization, and there's lots of things that need to be designed. So I said before, one way of doing is designing a target state, saying this is exactly what we want to look like in a few years' time, and then designing backwards, going, okay, where are we now? So don't you map out your current state, your target state, and then start to work through what are the transition points to be able to get there. The other one is to design iteratively. Start with your current state, look at some problems, and then address those. Then keep doing that as a cycle. In the end, it's going to be really up to you and your organization as a culture about which direction you want to go. And that's probably all going to come back from the original conversations that you've had. They're all going to come back from, is this a burning platform? Is this we're in a state of huge risk and we need to survive, or is this an enormous opportunity? I'm a big fan, particularly right now, of actually saying, with the whole sort of financial crisis and COVID going on, this is actually a huge opportunity for the education space. If you could sit back and design your organization with all the technology that's available now, without any of the historical or legacy stuff, what would it look like? And start asking those kinds of questions, because you might actually end up in a completely different point than just going, okay, how do we speed up what we're doing now? Which does, sort of putting old processes and new technology isn't necessarily the best way forward. From that point on, once you've done that, you then start to design the experiences. So how do you want your students to experience this change in your business? How do you want your staff to experience this change in your business? Why is that important? And of course, that has lots of softer measures in terms of importance, but the harder measures are around experience. If you can design the student experience, of course, it instantly impacts retention rates, and then by default, that will start to impact your brand and attract more students. Then from a workforce perspective, how you start to design your teams. What do you want to do to be able to make sure that your teams are coming together? Because it's in the initial phases, there is no perfect best case, sort of best practice for your organization. Probably you're going to have to start thinking about the team design, the capability design you need, and what that may look like, and be prepared to try things quickly and keep moving. And as I was saying before, what do you want your culture to look like? If you're starting to design culture, because culture quite often in a lot of organizations is just something that is evolved. Often culture is not designed. But when you're going through a transformation process of any sort, and digital transformations is one form of that, then that is an opportunity to sit back, describe your culture and describe the culture you want, and then start to design for that. Obviously culture is a set of behaviors and beliefs. Then how do we, I think Chris, you were saying that before, you've gone through this iterative phase with your own journey, and that has created in your DNA a set of behaviors and beliefs, so that everything happens in 2-week cycles. That's a perfect example.
Yeah, I've got to say, it wasn't necessarily always a comfortable
No.
And as a person leading that, I had diminishing returns on my popularity through that sort of transition. But ultimately, when you reach the other side, the rewards are great enough for that sort of enduring that short-term pain.
Transformation of any sort, asking people to change is never easy. It's just do the long-term benefits outweigh the short-term inaction quite often? And often the answer is yes. And then starting to think through your infrastructure, the governance aspect of it. So starting to think through as you're starting to design all these elements around your team, the experiences, your culture, the assets you need to create. What's your underlying infrastructure to deliver on that, both from a technology and then broader infrastructure perspective? And then finally, how are you setting your organization to govern that and understand that in a deep way? And I think making sure part of this journey, part of the design journey, part of the research journey should definitely be bringing your governing team on that journey, so they can fully understand the risk framework that you're starting to develop, and the way that you're starting to think about the options that you're moving forward.
Sure. Okay. And just before we jump to the next slide, I think I'd like to just hear 30 seconds from you in terms of how you would weight those mistakes or those bullets, because I think we've seen historically that things like infrastructure and governance has come first and kind of reverse engineered to meet the compliance framework instead of, trying to take advantage of the opportunity. And I know that you would hear this a lot around the student experience being something that people want to talk through. But, how have you seen that change in terms of people prioritizing those things?
Yeah, I think it's, I think a lot of organizations, so I could sort of talk about this in really broad Australian business context. Australia has been a fast follower, sort of technology wise, in the education space and across all business for quite some, pretty much, sort of GFC onwards. So if you think about the behaviors that happen around the GFC, so 2007, the share market crashed. The rest of the world went to sort of a bit of a state of panic. America and Europe and so on, all of it, we were doing work in the US at that point. And, the narrative coming out of the business leaders we were speaking to there was, our shareholders are losing confidence, our market cap's getting eroded. If we, these are public businesses. If we don't start to look at, different ways of working and look at every product we've got and every single process that we've got, then, we're going to die. So we need to really reinvent what we're doing to survive. So for them, it was, they were innovating, particularly around technology, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. So there was, that burning platform and then I think in Australia, the conversation was a little bit more, we've got mining, our economy's doing pretty well. The rest of the world looks scary. Let's just wait and see. And then I think wait and see turned into, oh, we've got to catch up. And that catch up mentality meant that people spent a lot of money on, the same technologies that were being used with their, potential competitors or similar businesses overseas. A lot of that focused around marketing and the top end of the technology stack, I suppose. But what wasn't being invested in was the culture, the teams side of it. And unfortunately, what that did is it created behaviors where people were spending quite a lot of money on big technology spends without thinking about how they're going to resource it and create sustainability into that. And then that created an environment where the stakeholders said, well, we need more value from that investment. And that put pressure on the people inside the business to just keep doing more and more and more that would actually ended up alienating the customer and not delivering the value they wanted.
Yeah.
So I think that the big thing here is going, how do we design the people side of it and bake in the change management as we go? And then, making sure that technology piece is there to enable all of that and amplify it and make it work and lock it in for a long, long, long time.
Yeah.
And I think that's the absolutely critical piece is just, making sure that, if you think about the people aspects of it, because, think about experiences from a student standpoint is basically saying, how do we not only just meet the needs of the students, but how do we change the students' experience and sort of that change management side from a customer perspective. And the teams and culture is all about obviously individuals inside your organization and the organization as a whole. So it's all people focused.
I think Chris is going to touch on that a bit later around, understanding what technology is even available, being more curious about what, instead of just choosing legacy, what is actually changed in my world from a digital or technology standpoint that I should be aware of, and what's my responsibility to know that. So, okay, onto the next slide, I think, because we've got a few slides left and we're running tight. So
sure, okay.
What do you do?
So what should I do? Start to design the process all your organization is going to use. Let's define the design process your organization is going to use. So who's going to be involved? What does design mean? How are you going to, it's not visual design. This is designing the type of organization that you want, that you and your team and your customers are all going to want to be part of. And then work through how that is going to work and how you're going to be able to, define the outputs that are going to be valuable and define the process that's going to be able to allow you to get there.
Great.
I'll move on. So the next phase is starting to think through the capabilities. So I won't spend time on this slide, but really what's critical here when you think about the capabilities is you have to ask those initial questions that we talked about first. So if you can try and ask some really challenging questions like, as I said, if you could design your organization now with artificial intelligence and automated decision-making at the heart, what would that do for your organization? What could that do? If we could design an organization where 90% of the administrative work was automated, what would that allow your organization to do? So ask these sort of tricky questions and get people to go and do research and come back to you with ideas. Then as that's happening, you're going to start to identify people inside your organization that are potential leaders. And I think that's a really good critical first step. And then you're going to start to, as your strategy is defined, you're going to be able to say, well, in order for us to deliver on that strategy, what are the skills, knowledge, and experience required? So basically, workforce planning side of it, what is required for us to be able to deliver on that? First of all, as a central team, but critically, what training do we have to give to board members, to executives, to other elements inside the organization so they know how to deal with this and they feel comfortable with it? And do we have the people inside our organization that with a bit of training could actually lead this, or do we need is that a hire? And I think going through that phase is really, really important. If it is going to be a hire, looking for somebody who is executed on this in a perfect way is going to be really hard. Looking for somebody who's been through it and has made a whole bunch of mistakes but still delivered value, I think is probably a really good way to go because everybody's learning at the moment.
Yeah.
And critically here is also what, if you don't get lost into things like marketing automation and overly, lots and lots of digital channels and all those sort of things, you can have a very, very small, highly skilled team. You can train them up that can have a massive, massive impact on your organization. And I think that's the critical thing to think about. So rather than going, we're going to have a huge team that's going to deliver every single, digital activity, and they're going to be spending all their time tweeting and all those. None of that's actually truly valuable. So start thinking about what the real value is.
Yeah, and I think in education, the luxury of large teams is often not there. So to be able to execute this in a like you say, a team of experts, small team of experts is the obvious path, I think, for most people.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of organisations are setting up a digital or innovation advisory board as well, which consists of partners, members of their team, maybe a board member, technology vendors, all coming together to debate direction and what's possible, and so particularly people who have been experienced in the space, so they can say, well, hang on, the path you're going down, I've seen before and it doesn't work. Here's the reasons why, and here's what to avoid. And I think that's a good thing to have.
And how does that feed in then to the next point, which is about culture?
So we're moving on. Yep. So then, so that's really about, so culture is obviously about shifting behaviors, and that point that we were talking about, before, making sure that everybody really kind of understands what it is we're trying to do. So, as we're, if you're getting the right capabilities in place, that's going to start to shift behavior, because you're going to start to have a maturing of language very, very quickly. But I think, going back to Chris's point earlier, it's the big shifts in behavior. It's that operating cadence. It's the way your organization evolves. It's the fact that we're not just saying we're going to, we're moving a bunch of stuff that we've always done, and now we're just taking it digital, which is basically, that's not digital transformation. That's investing in digital techniques. Digital transformation is starting to shift the way your organization works, and it actually potentially brings up a whole bunch of new revenue opportunities if you get it right. And I think that's the big thing here, is also that relentless focus on student outcomes. If you can build that in as an organization, education organizations are often very process orientated.
Yeah.
So if we can, and as a result, everybody gets very focused on their own job. But if we can start to shift the culture, and even just ask, when somebody's talking about a process, going, okay, can you replay that process to me, but through the eyes of a student? And just get people constantly thinking about, how is this going to impact the student? And then that's when people will start to realize, well, hang on, this process, even though we've been doing it for years, is the worst experience possible for a student. How do we fix that?
Okay.
So yeah, what to do there? So I think the real important there is, I think we talked about it earlier in the design phase, but it's how do you go through a process of baselining your culture? Like, it's a difficult thing to do often, and sometimes you might need a board member or outside help or something to help you do it. But if you can find a way to ask a lot of your execs and a lot of your team about what is our culture, what does it look like, develop up some hypotheses, maybe use an anonymized survey out to the rest of the staff to really define that. Then you can start to find a way to baseline it, and that will give you the words you need to describe your culture currently, and probably give you the words you need to then start to think about, well, what culture do we need to be able to win in this space? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the most important thing you possibly can do, because the more that you say that, the more that you can then go, well, if that's the culture we need, we need to restructure KPIs. We need to restructure people's job descriptions. We need to rethink about the behaviors, the values of the organization to be able to make this work. We may not, but quite often, the things that you will accept and won't accept will start to shift.
Change, yeah, okay. So that's a good shift now into the digital part. So we've talked a lot about the transformation, people, culture, but the digital piece is obviously critical to this. So, just do you want to just touch on these bullets quickly? We might hear from Chris as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really, I was talking about the architecture side of it. Often, just thinking through technology, different capabilities, often when you're looking at your overarching strategy, going, what are the capabilities we're going to need from technology to deliver on that? And that helps you define what is going to be needed, and then helps you narrow down your focus in terms of systems that are going to be required, and then how you're going to resource those to build in sustainability into the organization, and make sure that the team is really involved in that process. You've got to be careful though, because there's being involved in the process quite often can result in people going, well, here's the process that we currently use, build that into technology. Yeah. And it constantly saying, actually, this is an opportunity to redesign process to make it better. What's the best outcome we can look for here?
I think that's a very key point. And Chris, I might throw to you, if you flick to the next slide, Mark, meeting existing requirements and asking technology to retrofit that versus opening your mind up to what is possible. Do you want to just talk to your experience in that?
Yeah, sure. I think for us, what the role that we assume is problem solving with technology. And I think that all of what Mark talks about is that self-reflection, knowing your business, and then presenting that to a vendor. And then we have to translate that into something that's meaningful to solve that immediate problem, but also really move the dial into the future. And I think these are just three examples that I just wanted to call out just really sort of fast. But when we talked about student completion and attrition, that's been at the core of what we've been studying for a long time and how data can unlock that. It probably took 2 years of research before we even really committed to solving it in the application. And what we've come up with now is this concept of health. So monitoring health through a number of indicators that can be configured by provider, because it's not the same. No provider carries precisely the same set of variables when it comes to this stuff. So being able to configure that was super important. So now we've got this single indicator that actually finance can contribute to, and student success and support and the academic team can contribute to the same indicator, which gives us this connected sense of where risk might be. The second thing then was really, how do you manage support? So one of the things when we were interacting with our clients, this idea that lots of data was offline or in systems that were not necessarily ours. So we couldn't reconcile that data and give them meaningful ways that they could actually intervene or engage students. So we then moved to consolidating that into our system, which then became a supply and demand marketplace around services, which is effectively how you would manage student support. And I think this is one of the keys moving forward. When you think about something like students who were on campus, now they're at a distance, how do you interact? How do you engage? How do you make sure that they're supported through their studies? So this is things like mentoring, coaching, counseling, all of that side of it, all in one system. It gives you like a true single view student. And again, something that we've been working on for a number of years. It's an ongoing strategy to unlock the data that sits within that. And then I think the financial considerations. So lots of our clients have come to us with the idea of managing sort of deferred revenue and how that's offline and how they can't get real-time access to data around where their risk or their liability might be. So we've just brought that into the system, which makes frontline decision making much easier. So from a technology perspective, 3 things that we've heard about over an extended period translated into what we think is meaningful change in the application. I think if you just go on next, Mark.
Sure.
Sorry. I think from one of the things that we were considering is what's the relatively low investment things that you can do from a technology perspective. And one of the things that we said is just be open to change. And what I mean by that is just potentially look outside your business for help. There are probably resources inside your business who are interested, and you can activate those. And I think from talking as a vendor, just be ready to be challenged by us. We've invested heavily in studying that student experience, the staff experience, and we actually have done tons of mapping around that. So we've got a lot of knowledge that you could tap into And sometimes it might conflict with what you think you know about your own business. So just be ready to be challenged around that. That stay informed, James touched on it. I think in education, there's a core set of applications that you typically need. You're looking at the student management system, you're looking at whatever you do for learning, finance and CRM, which gives you a really good opportunity to know your options, actually invest in researching. Again, it's relatively low investment, but just know that technology moves fast. And if you're not aligned to that, if you're not sort of moving at the same speed, when it comes to a change in your business, you're going to have to do more research, longer research. And I just think it's easier to do that as a sort of ongoing commitment. And it is a virtuous cycle. Reach out, talk to vendors. It doesn't have to be commercial. I know that's hard for someone like James as a commercial director to hear, but sometimes we're willing to share intel, and conversations like that actually help us inform what we should do. So there's a virtuous cycle there. And I just think, just remember that implementation is not the end when it comes to technology. You should plan for an ongoing engagement. And what that means to me is that you should be constantly asking your vendor what their plan is. And you should be asking them what the next thing to get you excited is. What is their strategy? Where can we take you? And then just ask for a meeting. This idea that we implement and that's the end of the relationship, aside from the sort of account management, really you should be thinking strategy, not necessarily just account management. I think that's something we'd be willing to offer more of. So just think about that as an ongoing commitment or engagement.
Yeah, good. I think they're all really important points, actually. So I think we've got about a minute left. So if we just jump to, the purpose of the core theme today was what do we do to get started? And you've got some bullets on that last slide, Mark, which I think are important to just walk through quickly. What do we do?
I think the most important thing is just really starting that question, starting the discussion off and asking, trying to find a couple of hard questions to challenge people inside your organization. Like, if we could get rid of every piece of legacy thing and fix every single, horrible process everybody hates, what would we do? What would, if we could start from scratch right now, what kind of organization would we like to have? Or, another one, as I said, if we could really, really be the best at automation in our industry, what would that mean for our organization? That means you're going to have to probably get some experts in to talk about what's possible with automation or what's possible with technologies, but at least start that conversation. And as I said, avoid defaulting to current best practice. I think there is sometimes a very good reason to use best practice because it's low risk, but best practice, overseas doesn't always work here. And when you're talking about technology that's moving so fast and you're talking about an industry, so it's looking at what everybody else is doing, it doesn't make you unique. I think that in particularly, marketing automation is a really good example of that, where everybody jumped on the bandwagon of marketing automation. And in the end, a lot of the education providers ended up actually looking the same because they were all doing exactly the same techniques with the same technologies, rather than going, what is our brand, our organization, our students about, and what do we do different?
Yeah.
Really think about who you need on that journey. So who's going to advise, who's going to be part of the team. That's really important. And then start thinking through, what do these technologies mean for me? What is the data-led decision-making piece? What does automation mean for us? And as I said, critically, think about that whole student life cycle. If you could have one, to me, I think if you could have one metric that every single activity tied into, every single thing that you did, and it was longitudinal job outcomes. If you could say, that this activity is going to make the student feel more confident. This activity is going to make the student learn a bit better. This activity is going to make the student connect with the industry more effectively. Whatever it is, if that's all about longitudinal job outcomes, then I think you're probably heading in the right direction. And that's why, just thinking about that whole student life cycle as a continuous journey is obviously really, really critical. And of course, once they're out in the market and they've got a great job, they're probably going to be one of your best referrers. So that's probably best way to get started, I think.
Do now, okay. Monday the 8th. which is actually a public holiday in a lot of areas, but
Yeah.
okay, so we've run bang on a minute or two over, so we're going to wrap it up there. Just a reminder that we'll be circulating the recording and the deck from today, which will have Mark's contact details as well as Chris's, so you can reach out, connect, and engage with them directly off the back of today. Mark, Chris, thank you both for making the time and the investment into today's session. It was really useful and informative. And yeah, if there's anything else, the contact details will be on the follow-up. Have a great weekend.
Cheers.
Thank you.